And good morning, everyone. Again, for some. All right, well, good morning again, and good morning for those who we haven't seen yet, but good morning again for those who have been with us all morning. We appreciate you coming back. We're going to go ahead and get started so that we can hopefully finish on time. And we'll just have folks continue to come in as we get started here. So thank you, everyone who's coming today or coming to this session. This is a session related to FERPA, and which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And our presenter today is Josh Whitlock. He's a principal in the Charlotte, North Carolina office of Jackson Lewis PC. He focuses his practice on meeting the legal needs of higher education institutions, and he has extensive experience in defending colleges and universities in a broad range of litigation and investigations, as well as counseling them on a variety of issues, including Title IX, FERPA, the Clery Act, and disability-related compliance, the handling of sexual misconduct allegations, and student discipline and faculty tenure matters. Josh joins us this morning to provide an overview of the rights of our students and their families, as well as our responsibilities as related to the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, commonly referred to as FERPA. This is the law that protects the privacy of student educational records. This workshop is designed to provide and refresh your knowledge of the rules and governing access to and release of student information. Our hope is that by ensuring compliance with these regulations, we can avoid having to call on Josh or anyone else to represent us in the future. So thank you once again. And Josh, you certainly have the floor to get us started.
All right. Thanks very much, Ada. Good to be with you all. I'm not sure how many of you were in the last session and are jumping over this one, so I won't repeat my whole intro spiel. I'll just say it's a real privilege to be with you all. I mean, you all, I get the great opportunity to provide some counsel to folks at higher ed institutions, numerous higher ed institutions, but you all are the ones boots on the ground, interacting with students, interacting with parents, doing the heavy and important work day by day. So it's a privilege for me to try to help you with that by talking about these regulatory intersects. And as I said before, I have a real soft spot for community colleges and for Hampton Roads, having lived in Hampton Roads. So great to be with you all today. I hope I can say a couple things that are useful to you as it relates to FERPA, which really, and let's be honest, FERPA is a somewhat of a strange animal, right? Like no other law that I know of is exactly set up like FERPA. There are things about it that are counterintuitive, there are things about it that are very nuanced. And there are quite a few misconceptions about FERPA, and hopefully we can clear up a couple of those. And yet it's so important because it kind of intersects a lot of what you all do, boots on the ground, right? Because it deals with student information and how you can share it and when you can share it and how it can be used and not. So critical topic, a topic worth refreshing and a nuanced topic. And I will tell on myself here and tell you, I often have to go back and double check with regard to FERPA. I've been helping schools with FERPA for a dozen years now, and often I'll get a question, I'll say, I think I know the answer, but let me go to some resources that the Department of Education has that include a really great FAQ, and I'll point you to you all to that now. The Department of Education has a great FERPA FAQ, and let me just double check because there's some nuance to it. So let's unpack it a little bit. And I'm going to use I'll give you a little roadmap for how we're going to approach it. I'm going to do a five kind of categories of things just to organize them for us. We're going to do a 1 through 5 and unpack FERPA. and best practices around it through that. And then I'm going to share a few scenarios just for us to kind of quiz ourselves. You know, is there a FERPA issue here, or what would you do under FERPA here? And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. We'll leave some significant time for Q&A. And if we don't fill that all up with Q&A, then we'll get out a little bit early. I don't know if lunch is right after me, but just in case it is, I never want to stand between someone and food. So we definitely won't go over, and we might get out a few minutes early. So let's unpack FERPA. And let's start with, there's really no shiny way to do this other than kind of diving into what it does and does not prohibit and the nuance of that, so that we can kind of internalize that together. So let's unpack this number one here. What FERPA does is it provides students, and I'm going to read this definition, and as I read it, I'm going to stop in multiple places because kind of every piece of it is important to how we apply FERPA. So FERPA provides students, your students 18 plus. Why do I say 18 plus? Let me first pause there. Because over 18, a student 18 or over, the student holds the FERPA rights. 18 or younger, the parent holds the FERPA rights, even if the student is at your institution, right? So it provides students 18 plus and former students. And that's critically important as well. So if someone attended your institute, VPCC, and no longer is, they still have all the rights that we're going to discuss as relates to their records. Those rights don't go away when they leave the institution. Provides students 18 plus and former students really three key rights, three really important rights as relates to their records and personally identifiable information in their records. And the first two of these are, unless you work in Office of Enrollment Services and the registrar's office, the first two of these are, unless you're the main person or one of the main people tasked with administering FERPA at your institution, which I assume the vast majority of you aren't, the first two are kind of for informational purposes. And the third is where we have all the action kind of day to day. So first is the right to inspect education records. So know that a student, and also I should pause on education records, because that definition itself deserves some unpacking. In the number two, I'm going to get into the definition, the nuance of education records. But for now, we'll just run through this definition. So the opportunity to inspect education records, basically on demand, right? So if I'm a student or a former student of the institution, I can come to the institution and say, I would like to inspect, I would like to see, I would like to get a copy of, you know, all of my educational records, which is a big ask, and the institution would take the institution a while, or my education records related to this, you know, this class or this disciplinary matter. On demand probably wasn't the right term to use there. They can do that anytime they like. The institution actually has up to 45 days to provide the record in response to that request, because sometimes it takes a while and it is somewhat onerous. So that's the first right that a student has. That has implications for how, when don't forget about number one, though, when I talk about the breadth of the definition of education records, because that really does impact how you all do your work, because the rule that you should generally live by is, if it's put down in writing somewhere and it relates to a student, the student has the right to inspect it. And that applies also to emails, right? That applies to emails, that applies to communications with colleagues about students. If it goes down on paper, or on computer, it's going to qualify as an education record likely, and the student's going to have a right to inspect that. So that should guide how we talk about students in our records, right? And how we keep our records. They also have, and part of the reason that they have number one, the first right, is because of number two, which is they have the right to request an amendment to their education records. And that's not, again, unless you're the person tasked with dealing with that type of process at the institution, that's probably not something that you'll ever very much intersect with, but know that students do have that possibility. And then number three is where, again, most of the action is, which is that the students, and this is kind of a negative right, the students have the right to not to have personally identifiable information, which I'll define for you on the next slide. It's broad. I'll define it for you on the next slide. From education records disclosed without their consent, with some exceptions that we'll talk about. Let's unpack this piece a little bit. So they have the right not to have information from education records. And note, how many times does records show up in here? 3 or 4? Note that we're talking about records here. So I'll say early, and I'll probably say more than once, one of the misconceptions about FERPA is that FERPA applies to any and all information about or from students. Not so. FERPA applies to records. It applies to records and information derived from records, okay? And so if a student is talking to you about themselves, if they're giving you personal information, as personal as that might be, that's not FERPA covered information unless it's memorialized in a record and or you got it from a record. So note records as a limiting piece of this definition. And we'll come back to that, including in our scenarios. We'll work with that a little bit. And the right to not have it disclosed, which basically means, I mean, disclosed is basically a fancy word for shared, right? So if there's an education record with personally identifiable information, the student has the right for that not to be shared with anyone unless they consent to it, unless they say you can share that particular record, or you can share all my records with these particular people or this group of people. They can always do that. And there's a process at the institution for them to do that, or unless an exception applies. And we'll unpack that a little bit. And I highlight here your institution's VPCC's FERPA information. And I do that, if you were in the last session, you heard me compliment VPCC's Title IX webpage because it's robust and contains the information it should contain. And I'll similarly compliment this webpage. This is a useful statement for all of you and kind of any member of the VPCC community. It's a statement that's required by FERPA. Every year, the institution has to update and make this statement available on the website, which you all have done a good job of doing. Not every institution does that. And it's a statement that gives you key information like how do we define education records? How do we define personally identifiable information? Who is the person at the institution to which a student can provide a consent for their parents to view their records or other people to view their records? A lot of great information at that page. So I commend you to check that out and internalize it. All right. So everything in this definition turned on education records and then on PII within education records. So it begs the question, well, how are those things defined? Because that could mean a lot of different things to different people. Very broadly. Education records are defined as records that are directly related to a student and maintained by the school. Directly related to a student and maintained by the school. So not a lot of qualification there, right? If it's a record that's maintained by the institution, and maintained just means that the institution has it, or that an employee of the institution has it as it relates to a student. So the big thing to take away from that is that it includes emails, right? So an email about a student is an education record, because it's a record that's directly related to the student and it's maintained by the school. Now there's some exceptions to that definition. Sole possession records, like notes that you take just for yourself and never share with anyone else, even if about a student, those sole possession records, and you took them for the purposes of just having for yourself, those are not FERPA covered records, right? So the fallout from that means that well, you wouldn't share those because by definition, you don't share them. They're sole possession records. But it means that if a student asks for the right to inspect their education records, for example, they couldn't get your sole possession notes. Those aren't covered. FERPA rights don't extend to those. Same with law enforcement unit records. If they're kept within the law enforcement employment records, medical records, post-attendance records, those are not, FERPA rights do not extend to things in those categories, okay? But if they're not in those categories and they're maintained by the institution and they relate to a student, all FERPA rights attached to them. And the key piece about the consent is the consent to disclose, consent to share is PII. And why is that key? So say that I have a document, a long document that has a lot of information, including some information about a student, right? A lot of information that's not about a student particularly, has nothing to do with that particular student, and some information that's about that particular student. Let's walk through the analysis of that a little bit. That is an education record because that document, at least a portion of it, directly relates to the student and it's maintained by the school. But what does the student have the right to not have disclosed? The personally identifiable information within the education record, right? That's what it doesn't mean that nobody can at the institution can share that document with someone else because it has student information in it. It means that the student information in it is protected. And so often you see compliance with FERPA by redacting information from documents, personally identifiable information. Personally identifiable information is kind of what you think it would be. I mean, all of these things that I list here are kind of intuitive, right? Certainly if you have a student's name, social security number, student number, other things that can be used to identify the student. And that's really the key test. If you have a document, for example, that doesn't name the student, maybe doesn't include the student's social or even maybe their birth date or their student number. But if there's information in that document that would allow a reasonable person in the community to identify the student, if someone could put it together, if you're in a relatively small community and you say, whatever identifiable information, we're talking about a person who has classes on this day and looks like this and is this year in school. If the combination of the information could be put together to identify them, then it's personally identifiable. So very broad definition, and personally identifiable information is the protected information within these education records. So let's talk about exceptions to the consent requirement, right? Because the starting point as relates to the sharing of education records, if we're looking at a document that qualifies as an education record, if it's got personally identifiable information in it about a particular student, the starting point is that it can't be shared. It can't be shared at all, sent, shared, given to anybody inside or outside the institution, unless the student consents to that, or there's an exception applies, sorry, I'll wrinkle it up just a little bit. I told you FERPA is nuanced. It's a nuanced animal. So if the student consents, if an exception to consent applies, or if it's directory information, which I'll address in the next, in number 4. Directory information is just kind of information that's simple enough that it's excluded from personally identifiable information because it's not harmful to share. So if you have this record, it's an education record, it has PII in it, the starting point is that you can't share that with anyone, or information from that with anyone, unless one of those 3 things applies. Well, what are the exceptions? What are the key exceptions? One of these for you all, unless you're working in the registrar's office or tasked with administering FERPA at the institution, one of these for you all is much more important than the others, and it's the first one. It's other school official with a legitimate educational interest. And so, I'm scanning the questions for a second to see if there's anything I need to address or if I can just hold them to the end. Yeah. Okay. Great questions in here. I'm going to hold them to the end. I'm going to finish run through the 5 and leave a good bit of time because we got some great questions here. All right. So, okay. The exception that is most important for you all is the other school official with a legitimate educational interest exception. And what this means is if you need to share this information with someone else, with another employee at the institution to allow you to do your job or to allow them to do their job, then you can do that. So that's kind of the big gaping hole in the FERPA protections that allows you all to not be too terribly constrained by it, right? Because this is a relatively broad exception. If you, in your specific role, not just for general sharing, but if you in your role need to share that information with someone else to do your job or allow them to do their job within the institution, then there's an exception. There's a FERPA section with other school officials. Note that I'm not talking about external to the institution, right? Okay. For the registrar's office and for legal counsel and other folks that are administering things, there are other exceptions that would apply that are helpful just to know about. So if a student's transferring schools, schools are allowed to share some information between each other. You're allowed to share information that would otherwise be protected with government officials in connection with financial aid, accrediting organizations. A subpoena always trumps FERPA. And so if the institution receives a subpoena for protected information, the institution actually has to provide that. And then appropriate officials and authorities for emergencies and under specific state laws. So these, I'll break these into two kind of pieces. The first one is one that you don't have to go check with someone before you share information pursuant to this every time. If you have a close call, if you're like, gosh, I don't want to violate FERPA and I'm worried, about whether I will or not, then you can, but generally you can just move under this exception as needed to do your job, right? And just know that if you're sharing otherwise protected information and you're called on to justify that, you'll have to say why it was needful to do your job or to do someone else's job. The other ones, I would just say, if you think any of these other ones apply, then connect with your supervisor and or with the registrar's office and or with legal counsel to the institution. Don't make a solo call on any of these because, for example, sometimes a subpoena will go to someone at the institution who is not, legal counsel or the president. Sometimes a faculty member will get a subpoena. Well, it is true that a subpoena trumps FERPA and that ultimately the institution will need to share records in response to the subpoena. It's also true that there are a lot of hoops to jump through before that. So for example, the institution, before it shares records pursuant to a subpoena, the institution has to notify that student and give that student an opportunity to object. So don't make a solo call on that. Take that to someone, to legal counsel or to your supervisor so that that can be worked through. Directory information, again, is an exception to personally identifiable information. This is listed also in the webpage that I gave you earlier. This is information that the Department of Education and that VPCC have said, can generally be shared without violating FERPA. And so, let me hit these takeaways, and then I'm going to go to the questions before we do the scenarios, because there's some good questions here, and I think they'll help us work through the scenarios. So the takeaways are, handle and disclose records containing student information with great care, both internally and externally. If you're disclosing, and by disclosing, again, I mean sharing, if you're sharing an education record, personally identifiable information, an education record with anyone without the student's written consent, and I don't mean just that the student said, oh yeah, you can share that with someone, but that the student has gone through the process that laid out in the webpage that I pointed you to say, I consent to the sharing of X or Y type of information. If they haven't gone through that process and you're sharing it, just be sure about the justification. Again, one of the misconceptions of FERPA is that it's one main misconception is that it's about any information related to the student. I said that earlier. It's about information from and memorialized in records, not any and all information. Probably the second biggest misconception is that you all should be paralyzed by FERPA and shouldn't be sharing student information kind of anytime with other employees, with colleagues within the institution. That's not the case. Why is it not the case? Because of the other school officials exception, a big exception. So if you're going to share it, just in the back of your mind, say, what is my justification for this? Does this fit into needing to share this to do my job or to help the other person do their job? And or is there some other exception that I think might apply? All caps on the next one. I promised leadership that I would hit this point hard, and it's a really important point to belabor a little bit. Safety concerns always override FERPA. Always override FERPA. So if you need to share information to keep someone safe or to stop a harm, do that and let the FERPA chips fall later, and the institution will back you on that. And let me unpack that a little bit. But if you need to do that, then do it. Okay. If you have time to do the analysis about whether an exception applies or about the other school official exception, then do that analysis. Be careful. If you don't have time to move carefully and you need to move to keep people safe, do not be constrained by FERPA. Do not be paralyzed by FERPA. There have been any number of really tragic situations in higher education that, when kind of studied and traced back to their main point, kind of rooted from people being too constrained by FERPA. Situations where folks knew that something bad was about to happen, or had some kind of warning and could have done something about it if they'd shared it with others in the institution and didn't share that information. And when asked why, it came down to FERPA. So not to be a fear monger about that, but it's a really important point. If you're thinking about FERPA and safety, pick the safety. An example I give, because it's an example that came out in an institution that I've worked with, is a student sending an email to a professor and saying, at 11 a.m., I'm going to go to X room and I'm going to do harmful things. I won't get into the details. Well, the faculty member got that email at 10:50 something a.m., right? And so FERPA to the wind in that moment, and the faculty member went and warned everybody who needed to know to be safe about that. Was that protected information that came from an email that didn't have consent? Yeah, it was, but you had to move because of safety and arguably the other school officials exception. When in doubt, especially about whether an exception applies, ask. And again, I'll just make a case for familiarizing yourself with VPCC resources. You have a wonderful webpage here. It calls out folks that you can go to with other questions. You can point students to this, because this is where they can also get into consent issues and giving consent to their parents, for example, to see their records. So familiarize yourself with that. How are we on time? We're 11 o'clock. Let's jump into these questions. I see I have a bunch of questions here. Yeah, so there are a couple great, all excellent questions. There are a couple right at the start for about like a 17-year-old student versus an 18-year-old student, and whether and how FERPA applies to that. So the nuance there is, and someone correctly pointed out, that FERPA still applies to that student's records. The nuance there is that technically, when a student is under 18 years of age, the parents are the ones that hold the rights that we talked about before. So it's not that FERPA doesn't apply to that student. That's not the case at all. It's not that that student, by being 17, doesn't have their records protected. It's not that the family can't get a copy of the records to inspect. It's that because the person's under 18, that moves through the parents. The parents would need to be the ones to consent to a release. The parents would need to be the ones to request to see the records. If the student's 19, then the parents don't factor in the same way. In fact, if the student's 19, the parents don't have any rights in those records, essentially, with very limited exceptions. The student that now holds those rights would need to consent for the parents to even be able to view records. So it's not that FERPA applies or doesn't, it's just about who holds the FERPA rights as relates to those records. I hope that helps. Most of these questions are actually about that. It's quite possible that I said it in a confusing way, or combined in a confusing way with what you all heard yesterday. So let me pause there. Does anyone have other questions about that kind of 18-year-old line? again, being clear that FERPA applies, it's just who holds the rights.
I do.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I'm in the financial aid office, so we care very much about FERPA. And my question is about the age 18 and just the fact that our understanding, or my understanding, has always been that 18 or attend school beyond high school. That the FERPA rights transfer to the student. And I think that might be where everybody's kind of headed with this. Because you could have a 17-year-old college student who's done with high school. So I guess if you could clarify that point.
Yeah, you know what? I stand corrected on this. I stand corrected. You all are right. You all are right. I'm sorry about that. I stand corrected. That is the case. That is the case. So scrap what I said, and I'll correct it in the slides. It's 18 or enrolled at a post-secondary institution. That shifted over time, and there's been some lack of clarity about it over time. And I have myself confused on that, so I apologize. You're exactly right.
I appreciate you clarifying, because I was afraid we were going to have some very interesting discussions after this session. So thank you.
No, that knocks out all the questions. I'm embarrassed that I got that wrong, but it happens. I'm trying to keep a lot in my head, so I apologize. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. So,
Josh,
I'll tell you the reason that I messed that up is because I've been working with community colleges and others that have dual enrollment programs and younger students, like 13, like 14-year-olds going to high school. And to be quite frank, I need to get some clarity around those younger students now that I've corrected myself on that. So I'll do two things here. I'll update my slides to get that right, so y'all don't have bad information going forward. I'll send those back to Ada. And then let me do a little bit of research on how that applies to like a 15-year-old who might be dually enrolled. And I'll send that information to Ada too, and she can share it with y'all, Ada and Dr. Hollins. Go ahead. Someone else was going to say something, I think.
Josh, I was going to ask before we get off of the age piece, and I don't know if this is related to what anybody is sort of thinking about, but one thing that might be helpful is if you give some guidance about how one would respond to a parent who calls and says, I want to know, and I'm paraphrasing, right? Like, but I want to know this thing about my student. And we know that student's rights are protected, and we can't give them, the parent, a record without the release from the student. But can you just talk through, like, what are some of the ways that folks can continue to offer good service to our community members and their parents, but not violate the regulations that we have to keep records private? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. It's a tremendous question. I mean, one thing is just a, simple explanation to the parent, which the parent is, it's highly unlikely that the parent in asking has some misunderstanding of FERPA or not a full understanding of FERPA. So one thing that you can do is give some explanation to the parent to say, look, we are constrained by federal privacy laws. And whereas the rights to student records used to attach to you before your student came to college when they were in, K through 12, now by virtue of them being at a post-secondary institution, they hold those rights. And so actually I'm not able to share the information from those records with you unless they consent to it. Now, they certainly can consent though. And then that's a place where you can point them to the webpage and to the process. That's actually a really relatively easy thing, right? It's just a student filling out a form. So it's not one thing not to do that I've seen is to stop at the we can't share, right? It's important to go beyond the we can't share and make sure that they understand that it's unless the student consents to the sharing, and that there's a process, a relatively easy process in place for that. That's one thing I would say. Another thing is that, remember the limitation of what FERPA really protects. FERPA really protects education records and information from and memorialized in education records, right? So there are things that you can talk with a parent about. So don't be so constrained to say, there's nothing that I can tell you about my interaction with your student. I have to stop this conversation right here. Really, all that's protected is the information that's memorialized in or from education records. Now, certainly that's relatively broad in scope as relates to a student. That would include their disciplinary records. That would include their grades, for example. But there are things that you can talk about with the parent, knowing that it only applies to education records, the protection.
I see a hand up.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I wanted to ask a question, but I have to be careful. As long as I don't say any identifying factors, I can ask the question, like a general question, right, Josh?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if I have a student that registers for a class, but their parent contacts me through their email saying that the student's email is broken and that they're using the parent's email, and that the parents is calling on their behalf to let me know which class they want to sign up for next. And I informed him several times that I have to speak directly to a student, but then it'll be another email as if it's the student saying, okay, I want to, from the same email. So it's getting really complicated here because I know how involved the parent wants to be and wants to make sure that the student signs up and that the student, doesn't just overlook this and not come to class or whatever. But I'm really having a hard time here trying to get the students' permission. So what can I do to make sure that it's the student, or is it that serious? Like, do I have to? I mean, I've been confirming, like I asked the student to either make a new email or I'll try to call the student. That hasn't been a case yet. But what can I do? Because again, this parent, every single class, this parent contacts me and is like, okay, my son wants to take this class next. So, and I have to recite again, I can't talk to you, I have to talk to the student. And then here comes that email saying, okay, I want this class.
So again, great question. Real world scenario. I could see that coming up. Absolutely. My reaction to that is that if there's I don't see that as a FERPA issue, actually. So if there's a reason not to take that information from the parent and register for the student for the class, there may well be reasons within your procedures that you don't want to do that. You might, for some non-FERPA reason, say, we don't do it that way. I really need to hear from the student. That's the only way we register classes. But I don't see that the parent, and what you described, the parent and saying, I want to tell you what this student told me that they want. There's no request in there for the disclosure of information from personally identifiable information from an education record. So I don't see it as FERPA constraining you of being able to do that. There may well be other constraints, but I don't see FERPA as being the reason.
But here at Workforce Development, once we register them, we send them a receipt, an enrollment receipt. So that does have the student's information, a lot of their information, including the class that they're currently enrolled in. And I know that the parent requested the class, they already know which class they're getting into, but it has student ID, it has lumens numbers. So I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. I think if, good, thanks for throwing that in the mix, because I think that does potentially change it. So I think it matters. The devil's in the details of the conversation with the parent. I think if the parent says, I'm writing to let you know that my student wants to sign up for biology 201, and that's not yet a FERPA issue as I see it at that level, right? If in that conversation by email or over the phone or otherwise, information they start talking about or asking about information that's in that document, then you've gotten into a FERPA issue. If they say it says here that it says here that my student already took 101, and so why wouldn't they be eligible for 201? Then you're into talking about information that's memorialized in a document about the student. Do you see that distinction?
I definitely do. I definitely do. So that helps a bit. That definitely helps a bit. Thank you.
It's a great question. I mean, it's illustrative, right? Because again, it is about the education, the personally identifiable information, the education record, and the disclosure of that, the discussion of that particularly, that's protected.
Okay, I think
So
we have some more questions with hands up, if that's okay, and we can let folks ask their questions. Does that work?
yeah, there's a lot of questions here. How do you want to do it? Sorry, Ada. How do you want to
Yeah,
do it?
we've got two other folks who have their hands up.
Okay.
So maybe they could ask their questions and then we'll also get to
And then
those in
we'll
the
jump back
chat.
to the written ones. Okay,
Mhm.
that works.
Okay, so hi, Julia Barbaro from mathematics, sorry. With education records, does this include assignments? And if so, how long do we have to keep them for? We were told that we have to keep tests and finals for a certain number of years. I've forgotten the number now, 7 or 4 or something, and then we could get rid of them.
Great question. It does include assignments. You know, again, if it's a document that's maintained by the institution, which I think is what you're referring to, you maintain these assignments for some period of time. It's got some personally identifiable information about the student on it, then that's a FERPA covered record and information. In terms of how long you should keep it, excellent question, but not a FERPA question per se. So that's not constrained by FERPA, it's constrained by other laws and ultimately by your institution's document preservation policy. And different institutions are different on that.
Okay, one quick question about that though. So if the FERPA covers a former student and they have a right to get any of their institutional records.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Does the institutions override that they can't come back? So the institution policy can override that they can't come back in 20 years and say, I want to see my final?
Yeah, that's it. What a great clarifying question. Yeah, the right to inspect your institutional records by a former student doesn't mean that the institution has to keep them indefinitely forever. It's the right to inspect education records maintained, such as still maintained by the institution. So FERPA is not going to impose an amount of time that you have to keep them. FERPA is not going to say you have to keep them forever and a day because they might come back and want them. You're going to have to maintain in accordance with the institutional document retention policy. And if you have them when they ask, then they have a right to them.
I just put in the chat, the Library of Virginia has retention policies for documents related to universities and colleges. And so I just put that in the chat, which covers all of our records retention. So you can go ahead and look through that. It'll tell you how long you need to keep it from the point of the student interacting with that record. So hopefully that will help a little bit on that.
There's a question here that I'll just pick off real quick, and then we'll get back to the raised hands. Can the student not sign a FERPA waiver and then he gives the other party, the parent, permission to participate in email discussions, etc.? The student absolutely can. The student absolutely can sign a consent waiver. And there's some discussion in here as well about being able to get information about your child's bill, invoice amount to be able to pay it. And so that falls on the side of the distinction that when we were doing the example about registering for classes, that falls into getting into information from records, right? So I do think that crosses the line into protected information that you can't get to without a waiver. Raised hands. We got a couple others. No other raised hands?
I had a raised hand, but I can't hear Ada. She's
I'm
muted.
sorry, I just unmuted. Yes, go ahead, Tom, you're good.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
yeah. Josh, I have a rather tricky question. I'm a faculty member here. I don't work in enrollment services or anything, but I do coordinate a small program for the college. It's a co-enrollment program with the College of William and Mary. And our students take classes at William and Mary. They're not matriculated over there. They are strictly community college students. And I'm essentially the advisor and coordinator. I help I help them steer them through this program as they're taking classes that apply toward their 2-year degree. My question is this: when I bring in students to this program and I'm sort of serving as their advisor, I have them sign what's called a request to release education records. This is not, as far as I can tell, I'm looking at it right now on my screen, it is not an official FERPA waiver. It simply says, I do hereby give my permission to the community college to release the information listed below. And then I filled in the information that I regularly have to share with William and Mary officials in order to shepherd these students through the program. That includes their grades, academic transcripts, class schedule information, reports on student conduct and academic standing, all kinds of stuff that I'm sure is normally FERPA protected. And what I'm curious about is this sufficient to protect both the community college and me if a student should, for any reason, object to something that I've shared while they were in this co-enrollment program?
Great question. And I mean, kudos for getting something in writing from them. There would be some protection around what you've been doing, but I would say for ultimate protection and to get it just right under FERPA, I would do the same thing you're doing, but just do it with the institution specific FERPA waiver. So have them list the same items on there for consistency and because there's some kind of hyper technical requirements around that waiver. So I would just always direct it back to that one same document and never use anything other than that document.
So in other words, just the waiver, the FERPA waiver, the official FERPA waiver I should be using?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. But for your same purposes. I mean, one of the things that I loved about what you said is the specificity, you know, that you're getting into. So I think go about it the same way, just use that form, but make sure it lists all those specific categories for clarity's sake. But
Great,
the consistency is important around the one form.
Thank you.
Josh,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
I think that addresses, I went through the chat and there's a couple questions in there about if a student, let's say a student and a parent come to meet with someone, you know, and they're both in the meeting together, you're presuming that the student sort of brought the guardian with them. Do we still sort of need to like whip out the form and say, I just need you to sign this before I start having this conversation? Similarly, the other question was related to if the student copies a parent on an email, when we reply, do we reply all, or do we drop the parent, the guardian off the email? So maybe just addressing if the student has sort of brought in the parent, my presumption is we still need to say, here's this form real quick before I can reply, but maybe just address that. That's
right. Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, it happens a lot of different ways. You don't have to guess that doesn't happen all the time. And but the technical answer is yes, you should just have a practice of having them sign that waiver. Absolutely. Okay. Because I mean, you're a little bit, if they don't, you're a little bit at the mercy of them to, you know, all you have is what they said in the moment, right? Or the situation in the moment. So it's great to have it in writing. I absolutely would. Right on. The other question was just, again, sort of if there is a payer of the bill who is not the student, that does not give them open access to have information. It's still the student's right. So if you just give us a yes on that. That's right. Okay, that's great. Right. Yeah. And then I have one more. I'm going to ask Marie to go ahead and ask her question. Please.
Yeah, Josh, my question regarding email records. So if you're having a conversation with or about a student, even if whether it's between you and the student or between another faculty member or another administration, how long do those records have to be maintained?
Yeah, another great question. And what I'll say there is, again, not in accordance with the document, with the institution's document retention policy, which moves independent of FERPA. So FERPA won't impose on you a requirement to maintain that for any set period of time. What FERPA says is if you are maintaining it, if it is maintained by the institution, the student has certain rights in that. Whether you continue maintaining it or not is a question for the document retention policy. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, so so then the question goes to VPCC.
That's okay. Yeah,
That's
yeah, it
okay.
goes to VPCC's document retention policy. You wouldn't say, gosh, I'm about to delete this, but I can't because of FERPA. You know,
Okay.
you wouldn't say that. You would say, maybe I can't because of the document retention policy. But FERPA wouldn't constrain you to keep it for a certain amount of time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a question I can follow up on too, to try to figure out where that information lies and make sure that we get it out to everyone with that email retention, knowing too that we have different backup procedures that IT can search messages if they need to in a subpoena type situation, right? So there would be workarounds if we needed it. So,
Right.
you know, nothing is ever truly deleted. Right.
Sure.
Any other questions? All right.
We didn't really get to the scenarios, but we had great discussion. So, you know, is what I assume you don't want to go over, right, Ada, for the scenarios.
Yeah, I think that we're good at this point. If there's any other final questions, I know a lot of them are real like incident specific that folks have. And I think we just leave the door open to continue to have the conversation and hopefully provide clarity if there are more questions moving forward. But we really appreciate that. So
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And let me just say this before we jump off. If you want to, Ada, collect those questions and send them to me. I feel terribly bad about missing the 18+ thing. I'm glad you all straightened me out on it. I don't know how I had that brain freeze, but I'd like to try to partially make it up by send me questions, the lingering questions, and let me get you answers back so we can do a value add after the fact. And I'll tuck in there too. I want to do a little digging around dual enrollment. I have a couple questions for myself that I need to straighten out. So I'll include a little bit of detail on that when I send back answers.
that'd be really helpful. We'll definitely collect those questions as we move away from this training. So thank you, and we'll send them to you. All right. Once again, thank you all for joining us this morning. We hope you have a great lunch. I know there's a couple sort of faculty focused sessions this afternoon, but also open to anyone who is interested in the topic. So thanks again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.